Okay. Yeah, we have a couple folks out there, Stephen and Dewana. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. It's so good to see you all. It's good to be in community. Thank you to our in-person audience and obviously the folks who are joining us online. For those of you who I haven't had the privilege of meeting, I'm Royel Johnson, faculty member in higher ed and social work. I also chair our PhD program. But tonight, I have the privilege of serving as the moderator for this really important conversation focused on embedding wellness and post-secondary education. As many of you know, this is part of the grand series Challenges and Opportunities. And if you've been following along, last month, I think we had a really important conversation focused on K-12 education, right? Today, we're going to broaden the aperture a bit to focus on post-secondary ed. And then in the spring, we're going to focus on educators and school leaders. Before I jump into the program, I just want to pause and appreciate all the folks who have been working behind the scenes to bring to us a really remarkable program and uncomplicated programming experience. So I see Corey, I see Zoe, I know Eric is here somewhere online, Kane and her team, Beth, there's someone, yes. Can we give them a round of applause for all of the work that they're doing? And just a quick note, there will be a reception following, so if you stick around, you'll be able to have some food and snacks. There's some things in the back. This is how it's going to sort of work. I'm going to introduce our esteemed panelists. They're going to present for about 8 minutes. I'm going to be very stern on the 8 minutes, like I'm in a conference session. I won't be that mean. But they'll present, and we'll use that as sort of fodder for the conversation that I will moderate for about 30, 40 minutes, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. So get your questions ready, and we'll be looking forward to engaging. How's that sound? Good. So allow me to introduce our panelists. First up, we have Rudy Roman, who is Assistant Professor of Clinical Education here in the School of Education. Can we appreciate him? Then we have Julie Posselt, who is a professor in the School of Education and also Associate Dean of the Graduate School and Executive Director of CERP. Next up, we have Adrian H. Huerta, Assistant Professor in the Puglia Center for Higher Education here in the School of Ed. And last but not least, Alan G. Green, who is Professor of Clinical Education here in the School of Ed and the Faculty Athletics Representative. Can we appreciate him? Okay, I think I'm going to get out of Rudy's way to offer his commentary. Yes.
Okay. Hi, everyone. So today I have the opportunity to talk a little bit about just the experiences from a mental health standpoint of the first generation college students, more specifically the Latino, Latina, Latinx community. Now, before we jump into that, I think it's really important if we have a general idea of what well-being or mental well-being stands for, or how you would define it. If you look around you, and you were to ask your person sitting directly next to you, what is your expectation of this? I guarantee you that most of you are going to have a very different take on what mental well-being stands for, or how you define it. So for the sake of our conversation today, I'd like for us to take it, or to define it in the following manner. And this is from the World Health Organization. It's a state of well-being in which an individual realizes his or her own abilities, can cope with the normal stressors of life, can work productively, and is able to make a contribution to his or her own community. Now, when you think about that, it says nothing specifically of, is there a mental health diagnosis? Is there anything like that? That doesn't necessarily mean that well-being is defined by simply not having a mental health diagnosis. It's a very interesting continuum when you take it into consideration, because all of us here can have the exact same experience, yet have a different interpretation of that experience. So it's really important to always take that into consideration when we are talking about well-being. The other thing, too, when we talk about mental well-being, it's really knowing what brings you joy or doing what brings you joy. How does that align with your personal values? So that's going to be key to a lot of this. On top of that, there's an engagement or developing these meaningful relationships with others. But then when you look at the next point, which is probably one of the most difficult parts, is having an understanding of yourself. So be mindful of all that when we are talking about well-being as a whole. Also being aware of what's your baseline. When is it that I feel dysregulated? How can I get to a point of like, once I get to this point, then I'm able to seek help? So when you combine all that together, I want you to consider all this when defining mental health well-being. 3 principles that are associated with this: fulfillment, purpose, and connection, and hopefully you are seeing how that ties in to the original points that I've mentioned already. And lastly, the other point that I made already, we gotta be mindful of the experiences of others. Again, because it's important to remember that mental well-being tends to vary across cultures and even intercultural differences. Myself, being first generation, my parents are originally from Guatemala. If I were to speak to another Latino, Latina, and ask them about this, there's gonna be differences even within the Latino community. So just be very, very mindful of that. So how does all this connect to first generation college students? What are some of the struggles that we tend to see, especially, again, first generation Latinx students? When you look at it from an undergraduate standpoint, there's this identity development, right? When you look at the average undergrad student, we're looking at 17 if you really go in early, 17, 18, 19, maybe 20 as a transfer student. But during all this, there's still that development of self. Who am I as an individual? And even when you connect it to the previous slide of knowing who you are, there you're seeing part of those struggles. There's also having that initial experience of experiences for the first time. It may be developing relationships with others, maybe romantic relationships. Maybe suddenly you're going to parties that you didn't go to before. Maybe there's alcohol there. Now you're having these different types of experiences that you didn't necessarily have before. There's a homesickness component to all of this. When you look at a lot of first generation college students that I've had the opportunity to work with here on campus, many of them are from different states. So this is the very first time that they've had to take care of themselves all by themselves. There's an adjustment to academic expectations. I understand that high school can be very difficult, but when you compare that to the college experience, it's very different, especially when you take into consideration now you're on your own. Before in high school, okay, remember guys, tomorrow your homework is this, this, and that, problems 10 through 12, or 10 through 20, whatever the case may be. Here's your syllabus, you're on your own. So you gotta be able to figure that on your own. How do you develop that structure for yourself? So that's a big part that tends to be a struggle for a number of our students. Also looking into the environmental differences, there's also the social and emotional challenges. Now, when I talk about the environmental differences, we're talking about a marginalized community being in a completely different place and now having to be aware of how to adjust to all of that. Okay, I'm gonna be a little bit quicker because I already got my 3-minute mark and I can ramble. Okay, so from a graduate standpoint, there's this isolation where you're here for potentially 2 to 3 years, do your program, and how do you develop that sense of community in such a short period of time? There's also more responsibilities. It could be family, it could be school, work. And from a cultural standpoint, how many of our students are now caregivers? It could be for grandparents. It could be maybe for a sibling with special needs. So taking all that into consideration with some of these struggles. The impact on COVID has been huge for our students. Even if you were a social butterfly initially, we were all caged up to a certain degree. We weren't able to socialize with other people. Now we're out on our own again and trying to develop these relationships when we lost the skill set on how to do it. So if you think about having maybe a broken leg, you don't just take off the cast and start running. You strengthen the muscle. Little by little, you're able to walk. Eventually, you get rid of the crutches. You finally start running. This is no different when it comes to the social part of it. Cultural and family expectations, and also the lack of family support has been huge. And of course, limited financial resources. Now, what's been the impact for our students? A big part is struggling to find a sense of community or a sense of belonging. I'm here on my own, what do I do? The interesting part about that, which tends to happen quite a bit, you see an increase in depressive symptoms and anxiety as a whole. You see a lot of unmet mental health needs, even though there's an increase in symptoms. And then again, the stressors that are associated with attending a predominantly white institution. Now, what have we learned from all of this? There are a number of barriers for our marginalized communities that tend to prevent them from accessing mental health services, the biggest one being the stigmas that are associated with mental health symptoms. There's a need for outreach and education. Okay, now I got 1 minute. Okay. Need for outreach and education, making our students aware of the services that are available to them. There's an impact of systems on students, and again, the stigmas related to mental health, as I've mentioned already. Now that we have all this information, what does all this mean? It really focuses on the human need for connection and community. So what has the university done as a whole, to use USC as an example? They've focused on using the cultural centers here at the university and embedding therapists there that match the culture of the cultural center. So you end up meeting the student where they are at. You are able to give them a provider who is able to connect with them from a cultural standpoint. And there might be also this expectation of shared worldviews, which simplifies the ability to connect with that individual. So it makes it easier to access counseling services. It also provides an opportunity for more informal talks without it necessarily having to feel like a therapy session. So it takes away the stigma by making it an informal conversation. It bridges the counseling center with the cultural center. So again, it provides a safe space, a sense of community to be able to be vulnerable with other people. Now, the unfortunate part about this, that only around 21% of universities offer embedded counseling centers. And on top of that, they tend to focus more on the athletics or specific academic departments. They're not cultural centers. So what are the expected outcomes and conclusions from all this? There's an increased utilization of mental health services because of the examples that I gave already. Working with a culturally matched therapist, which reduces the stigma and increases the trust within the client, the student, and the therapist, which eventually leads to culturally affirming care. And it also gives a voice to those that are often silenced or that tend to be invisible within this community. We tend to find a balance between culture and personal identity, and it's building communities, developing connections and experiences, and experiencing a sense of belonging. So my apologies, I had to rush a little bit and then I will pass it on.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. Go Dodgers. So it's my pleasure to have the chance to speak with you a little bit more about the graduate student population that Rudy introduced us to. For the last 8 or so years, I've been doing research and research practice partnerships around graduate education, and specifically around what universities can do to help improve the experiences of graduate students so that just maybe we don't need quite as many embedded counselors in our systems. So let me start with a little bit of a context for why well-being is so principally important in graduate education. First, how many of you have been in graduate school in this room? Yeah, we are not a normal room, right? But for those who are here, let's make sure we understand and acknowledge that if you are in an enterprise that is exclusively or principally at least focused on the life of the mind, how you are doing with respect to mental health doesn't just affect your day-to-day, it affects your ability to engage in the work. And many, unfortunately, of the symptoms that people associate with mental illness intersect problematically with what we think of as a good student, and especially a good graduate student. Productivity, creativity, consistency, reliability, on-timeness, all of these things that we think of as being on your game as a graduate student, if you've ever been through a period of difficulty, you might recognize that those become challenging. So in our case, we want to focus on a few things. Number one, that there are really significant individual and organizational consequences when we see mental health and well-being compromised in the graduate student population. First, obviously, emotional health is directly related to a person's physical health. And we know that when people have untreated mental health needs, we tend to see more graduate students depart their programs. From an organizational or a group standpoint, we know that healthy academic communities are more creative, more productive. I think we all know what it feels like to be in a space where people are at their best. And obviously, part of operating at our best is creating an environment in which our colleagues are able to thrive. However, we know that also attrition is costly for everyone involved. As the Associate Dean in the Graduate School, I spend a lot of days and nights thinking about the cost per graduate student and what we are doing to ensure that the graduate students whom we enroll are able to have the best possible experiences at USC. Because both for that student and for the university, every lost student is a significant impact on their life. So I had the opportunity in 2017, 2018 to do a fellowship with the National Academy of Education and Spencer Foundation. And the focus of it was looking specifically at discrimination, competitiveness, and support among graduate students, and helping to understand those as drivers for disparities in well-being by race and gender. And one of the things I had to do as a function of this project was a massive literature review. And I want to share with you the mega findings from that literature review, because I think it's helpful in sort of boiling down what makes for graduate student well-being. There's plenty of evidence that shows that people's interpersonal interactions can have an effect on them. And hopefully, if you leave this meeting tonight with a little bit more energy than you had otherwise, that's like a measurable uptick for you. But it also affects your experiences in graduate school with your faculty advisor, with your professors, with other students. There's a lot from the standpoint of organizational policy and practice that can be done that is associated with well-being. And sometimes these things are potentially bidirectional. For example, if you see high-quality performance from graduate students, it could be that the program is training them well, or it could be that they selected really good graduate students, right? So there's always these bidirectionalities in these types of things, but policies and practices are one factor. A third is people's educational trajectories. I don't know how many of you were first generation as an undergraduate or a graduate student, but it can come with some pressure for your community, for your family. And people have documented that first-generation graduate students do experience more pressure, more anxiety than do people who were second generation and beyond. So I just want to acknowledge that and name that. If that was you, know that that's normal. And then finally, community values and norms are another dynamic in the literature that we tend to see some evidence that is associated with well-being. When a community prioritizes well-being, when they prioritize 9-to-5 schedules and trying to minimize communication outside of those hours, you tend to see better well-being among employees. Along the way, though, I think, as Rudy mentioned, a lot is individual perception and experience. That two people can go through the same program and have relatively similar experiences, but read them very differently. They can be a part of the same research group and experience it differently. The same class, they can come to a session like this. So it's important to acknowledge that in all of this, there's a lot that we can do with respect to the culture, the organization, as well as the kind of norms that we have, but that along the way, individuals will still be experiencing that. One of the other great experiences that I've had in relation to this work was sitting on a consensus study for the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine that was titled Mental Health, Substance Use, and Well-Being in Higher Education, Supporting the Whole Student. And our major conclusion was that although the common narrative is that if universities want to see better outcomes with respect to mental health, that they should hire more counselors, that there's actually a lot more that we can do. And that if instead we can reframe mental health and well-being to being an all-hands issue, where everybody recognizes, whether it's faculty, TAs, advisors, and peers, that our everyday behaviors have significant impacts on one another, there's actually a culture of well-being that can be created on our campuses. And I see some of you nodding, like maybe you've seen glimmers of this in your life. What this can also do is reduce the demand on counseling centers and potentially open up opportunities for hiring when it does occur to have same identity-related counselors. A second major finding was to acknowledge the power of our communications, both the communications that come from the university, as well as the communications that we have amongst ourselves. And to examine also how the policies that are in place within an institution send a message about what matters and why. Finally, I want to highlight that if we ensure that the structures of graduate education and professional culture are not at odds with well-being, we create a better sort of alignment, a better sort of world in which people can see that they don't have to turn on a version of themselves for work and school that is different than the one that they go home to at the end of the day. And what does this take? This takes doing some uncomfortable work of creating mechanisms for accountability when problematic behaviors occur. It means we should be developing and selecting for people so that they have opportunities to cultivate socio-emotional competencies, but also that faculty mentors are aware of the impact that their behaviors had. And so here I just want to close with a quick note that if any of you are interested, one of the areas of impact that our team has been able to have, and shout out to Jordan Kenke in the room who is part of this work, is the Equity in Graduate Education Consortium, where we have 3 different tracks where member universities get a chance to grow in terms of their practices in different areas where we select and serve graduate students. One of our tracks concerns mentoring and well-being, and we're currently enrolling new institutions and organizations. So if any of you are attending from outside USC, and you might be interested in having your organization join our consortium, please get in touch, and I would love to tell you more about how we're working with institutions like ours to help move the needle on this issue. Thank you.
Okay. Oh, it is on. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Adrian Huerta. I'm an assistant professor of education, and for the last 12 years, I've been interviewing former gang members, gang-involved youth as young as 11 years old, and system-impacted people, formerly incarcerated 5, 10, 15, 25 years of their lives. So when I had the opportunity to talk about mental health, I was really stuck. I was like, how do I talk about 100 different people from all different parts of the US and their experiences in either K through 12 or in higher ed? So some of the things that I started thinking about, like just like boilerplate things, I was like, fractured relationships. Like how many young folks, whether, again, system involved, former gang members, had broken relationships at home, school, or in their communities. And one way that you get control over your life is that you act out. You act out because that's how you get control over a situation. That's how you push back when you feel injustice at school or in the community or against police that are harassing you. You push back. But often there's consequences for pushing back. You're punished more. Right? So you get more embedded in a system. Trauma. When I was interviewing these people, I laughed, I cried, I felt anger that people were able to treat kids really poorly, that people experience inhumane things while they're incarcerated. And how do you experience all those things, and then you're expected just to perform in the classroom. Whether K through 12 or higher ed, you're supposed to break away from that and just isolate and focus on your studies. But how do you do that when you've been conditioned not to ask for help, right? That you don't know that you have all these undiagnosed traumas because that's normal, right? ACEs is normal. Adverse childhood experiences is normal in your community, your context. Like, how do you know and see that that's different, right? So then it's very difficult for you to ask for help when you've never trusted anyone. Right. So then there's that break or that divide. So you do decide to go get help, whether that's a counselor on a college campus or you go to a community center and you're able to access free therapy. You'll be lucky if that person is culturally competent and be able to support you and understand you and not fear you. Right. You say, oh, I was gang involved. Oh, I was incarcerated. Or they profile you because of how you look. And then all of a sudden you're sitting with someone and you're trying to get help, but they're afraid of you. So that's another tension of like, how do we support system-impacted youth when there's all these different pressures and tensions to try to just be a student, to try to be a parent, or whatever your multiple identities are. And one of the additional challenges connected to this in building that trust and healthy relationships, it's like, especially for educators, because I think it was like a couple weeks ago, I did a guest lecture in a classroom. And someone that was an assistant professor or assistant principal and said, how do I help these kids who I think are gang involved? I was like, that's where the tension is. I was like, because you're also a mandatory reporter. Yeah. So if that kid tells you X, Y, and Z is happening at home, then you are obligated to report that out. But sometimes it's like, if kids are experiencing those tensions or a bunch of different things, it's like, how do you diagnose poverty, right? If poverty is an issue at home and a kid is hungry and a kid doesn't have clothes and a kid doesn't have all these things, and a mental health professional is like, oh, that's child abuse. They just need food, right? They need governmental support. They need all these other things to be able to like be whole, to be present, to be able to focus like on learning. I think that's something that we saw during COVID, right? When school districts across the US provided meals to kids, academic performance went up. As soon as that ended, we started seeing those dips again because kids were hungry. So critical takeaways about thinking about system-impacted folks, you know, and after I put this up, I was like, oh, you know, I should have revised them. It's like, how do you give system-impacted youth or adults a reason to trust you? What is going to be that reason that they're going to trust you, right? And how do you be empathetic versus sympathetic? Because young people know, oh, this person is just pitying me. That's not what folks need. They need empathy, right? That's when you that's a whole different dimension of who you are as a person in supporting a young person or a formerly incarcerated folk. And then the third most difficult part, especially for educators, again, K through 16, is how are you selectively vulnerable with people? How do you share a little bit about yourself with them to be like, hey, I understand you, here's some things that I went through, right? Because then you yourself are being vulnerable. You know, sometimes you'll feel like you're naked in front of another person because you're like, I just shared all this stuff. Is it going to get out? Or how is it going to get out? How's that going to impact my career? So again, these are like really important dimensions of supporting young people or system-impacted people in trying to, you know, persist to that high school diploma, to that certificate, to that credential, to whatever they're trying to do. So we already know that there's a bunch of challenges in K through 12 in higher ed, right? We know K through 12 is underfunded, that educators are overstretched, that people are just burnt out, like multiple dimensions, right? But simultaneously, many of those educators hold lower expectations for system-impacted youth, either because they're gang involved or foster care system or on probation, blah, blah, blah. It's like, well, and one of the participants I interviewed that has a master's degree going currently for a PhD, he shared that, no, actually, the different person, master's degree, gang involved for 25 years, and as a 9th grader, went to the front office because he had to provide proof of residency to be able to enroll in that school. And the educator's like, you know, don't bother bringing that piece of paper in. You're just going to die or end up in jail. And said that to a 9th grader. And that 9th grader, that was the day they decided to quit school. And he quit school for the next 10 plus years and just got more deeply embedded in his gang. Another person from Northern California, finishing up his doctoral program. He's a faculty member at a community college. He talked about a school leader saying, you know, you're just a menace to the learning environment. And what did he do? He got even more angry at school. And he's like, you want to see a menace? I'm going to show you a menace. So it's really easy for us as educators to say, well, this kid does these things because he lives in that neighborhood. So how do we start pushing back against these lower expectations that we have for young people? As we know that culturally relevant pedagogies and curriculum are really important in the classroom, but we're also seeing a lot of division across the country about, are we allowed to teach about certain divisive cultures, right? Because empowering young people to learn about their backgrounds, I guess in some spaces is a really bad thing. But we also know that system-impacted people are hyper-criminalized in K through 12. As soon as you get suspended, as soon as you get expelled, you have that scarlet A on you, right? Because you're always going to be that kid. So, you know, I'm really pushing educators to like really think differently and start challenging their own internal biases and unconscious biases and how we think about supporting them. And that's just little kids. We haven't even talked about system-impacted people, right? That maybe, we're incarcerated 5, 10, 15 years of their lives. Like often those participants tell me, yeah, I was in class and I could tell people were afraid of me. The teacher was afraid, or the professor was afraid of me. My classmates didn't want to do group projects with me. You know, I went to the financial aid office. I started asking for stuff and they threatened to call police on me because they were afraid of me. So we got to push and challenge ourselves to think differently about supporting folks, because often these students they're told directly and indirectly that you're a problem and you're an outsider. And, you know, again, for these folks that are in school, they also are dealing with their own fears. Am I going to fail? Am I going to be able to get help? Am I going to be able to do these things, you know, like to become a successful student, but then also maybe in the back of their mind, they're worried about violence on themselves for past actions or behaviors that they did in their communities. So again, that's it's messy. It's really messy when we think about folks. So, you know, again, I'm challenging you all to reframe, to think about our biases, our unconscious biases in supporting folks, but then also like how do we expand resources that are, again, culturally relevant, that are sensitive to whether you're a social worker on a college campus, where you're a counselor on a college campus, to think about empowering and uplifting students to have better opportunities. So what does this mean for K through 16? A little bit to reinforce it. Like, how do we provide micro affirmations to people that are system impacted? Be like, hey, you did a really good job. Hey, you know, I noticed that, you know, you struggled with this. You could have, like, maybe this paper would have been so much stronger if you could have done these things, but I really like what you did, right? So many of the young people that I interviewed in continuation schools were like, you know, I was trying. I stopped doing drugs. I stopped drinking. I was trying to raise my hand, and the teacher still treated them really bad. Why do I know that? Because I was sitting there watching those kids really try, and educators ignore them. So, you know, let's push ourselves to, again, provide those affirmations. And how do we start deprogramming ourselves, again, with these biases that we have towards system-impacted people? How do we think about trauma-informed practices? Because, again, like, I know K through 12 offers a lot of trauma-informed things, but how do we step into social worker spaces or other spaces to learn how do they do it, right? Maybe they're doing it better than we are. And I would also say we got to challenge our colleagues that do say deficit-oriented things about people or communities that are system involved. And in my last minute, you know, again, I want to stress this point about cultivating trust. How do we help students to learn to become their own champions and advocates on college campuses, but also put it on the institutions to be champions and advocates for folks? Normalizing help-seeking behaviors. That's something that we've done at Long Beach City College with the Phoenix Scholars Program, and the students, these are gang-impacted, gang-involved youth, are comfortable asking for help. But we have to normalize that, and we did that through selective vulnerability of like, hey, I went to therapy, hey, I failed a class, hey, I did all these things, but I was successful because of these people. And lastly, like, how do we like promote these spaces, cultures, or pockets where young people feel involved or included, or how do we create inclusivity in different spaces in higher ed for system-impacted folks? So with that, thank you so much.
Okay, I'll scoot over here. So in the time that I have, I would like to paint a picture of how higher education is both a strategy or a pathway to wellness, as well as a site or location where the conditions of wellness exist to varying degrees or another, right? And so in the case particularly for Black student athletes, football players, the pursuit of wellness presents us with a unique set of opportunities and challenges that can hopefully inform your practice in terms of your own pursuit of wellness and well-being, as well as that of the students and others that you work on behalf of. So it helps to think about higher education in all of its forms. Sorry, I'm going to try and not get ahead of myself here. In all of its forms as both a gateway to opportunity, but also a lot of gatekeeping to opportunity and wellness, right? And I see a lot of people maybe nodding their heads in terms of affirmation, right? And so the opportunities that exist there, we have to sort of manage those stresses in one way or another, because it's a dichotomous space, right? College is a dichotomous space with regards to there's opportunity for support while there's a lot of stress. There are opportunities to for what do you call it, self-discovery, but there's isolation. There's opportunity for mental health, but also the stigma of mental illness. So we're grappling with these things, as well as agency and a lack of control. Or in the part of student athletes, particularly football players, and most student athletes, their entire days are scheduled from the time they get up in the morning to the time they go to bed. So the control is another barrier, right? And so when I think about my own experiences, as someone who wandered onto a college campus some 40 plus years ago to get an education, to play football, and to be somebody, right? But over time, a lot of things happened. I had the opportunity to play, I graduated, I actually coached football, I became a therapist, a researcher, and now a clinical faculty, a clinical professor here at Rossier and other places, but also in my role as a faculty athletics representative, I've learned over time that there's a need to grapple with this dichotomous space of higher education through an ever-evolving system of accountability that's based on authentic relationships and agency. And it's a really hard thing to do in order to push back against that single story of what Black student athletes are about. And if you think about the single story as being a notion of, for Black student athletes, right? Well, the idea of a single story in and of itself is it perpetuates stereotypes. It also masks the complexity of the human experience and the relationships that it exists. And for Black football players at a top university such as this one, those issues are compounded by the way in which they experience day-to-day life, right? And so we have to figure out how to have the kind of relationships with them to inform our own practice and to be sure to engage in deeper connections and have more meaningful relationships to help make decisions about the world that they live in. And in order to do that, I use the work of De Oliveira and her mapping of, or cartography tool as a way of mapping the way change exists on a campus, right? And so when I take a look at my various roles, not only with student athletes, but as a professor in the classroom, chairing dissertations, working on courses and programs, I'm always constantly trying to push the envelope, whether it's for Black students, whether it's for any student, and trying to understand that higher education is a space where there are things that people feel like, oh, everything is great. There's an opportunity to just exist, and we're doing you a favor by being here, and so don't push the envelope too hard, to a space of soft reform where change is looked at as like, well, we'll do a little bit of something, and so fighting, for example, to have therapists who look like our student athletes and can relate to them becomes a battle that we have to sort of take on, right? Or to radical reform spaces where the idea of the moment of George Floyd takes us to a point where our student athletes themselves are demanding for voice and representation, and we make changes and create initiatives and a director of DEI and that sort of thing. Again, these various spaces exist, and you have to sort of know how to challenge yourself and work with others within them. And then the final space of beyond reform is just this unknown territory that we find ourselves in even now in college sports with NIL and revenue share and changes that never could have been fathomed a year or two ago, but trying to figure out how to grapple with making sure that we are putting those accountability systems in place. And to do that, I want to sort of just talk about, pick up where my colleague, Dr. Gaxiola Mateo, talked in the last time about through-line questioning. And that's questions that we ask ourselves, and we ask each other, and we encourage others to ask of themselves, right? And sorry about the highlighting here, but because of the transitions, but there are questions that I have to ask myself in terms of like, what opportunities exist within my role to disrupt and push beyond the boundaries that I feel comfortable in, and encouraging my colleagues to talk about their own biases and what role they have in terms of working with student athletes, and with student athletes themselves, what aspects of their identity and experiences would they like to see changed and addressed on campus, right? And so this last piece here, as I close up, brings me to the example, the video clip I want to show you, where 2 years ago we had an opportunity for our student athletes to travel to Europe, a sponsored trip by the Shoah Foundation, to study sites of the Holocaust and kind of understand issues around anti-Semitism and hate. And a certain group of our student athletes, Black football players in particular, were not allowed to go. And they felt some kind of way about that. And they really felt upset about it when the others came back and told them how warm and moving and great the experience was. And so over the second year, we pushed, they pushed and they represented themselves and they talked, and we encouraged them to demand their right to go and have an experience beyond going to class and playing football. And so they got a chance to go, and it was a really wonderful experience. And I want to play this clip here for you. But I want you to watch the clip to think about, yeah, it's a great story. They got to do all these things, the wonderful things they say. But the idea of how it went from something that they were not allowed to do, right, to something where through authentic relationships, accountability systems, that we were able to sort of have the things in place for them to push back and to be able to go. And now how that is seen as this bright, shiny thing that someone made happen, okay? So if I can make that play here.
Welcome in, Tom, live from Arlington right now. A historic day for USC, making its Big Ten debut up at Michigan. Several Trojans spent part of their offseason learning about one of the darkest parts of history, but in a powerful way. Tom?
No doubt about that. Great to be with you, Rob. When these players made this particular trip, that they're going to make today, in fact, right? For that debut, they're going to go from Los Angeles to Ann Arbor, roughly 2,000 miles. But a handful of Trojans made a very different journey this past off-season to learn and understand more about a part of history that can never be forgotten. It's a journey that changed them in ways that goes far beyond any field.
Every season, so many come to watch them, to cheer them, to witness USC play and perform. But before this season, several Trojans chose to become witnesses themselves to the darkest of histories.
Hearing from it firsthand, we now become witnesses ourselves. Not letting the story die out, not letting the legacy, not letting all that pain and stuff just fade away into an abyss. That's how we grow as society.
This summer, through the USC Student Leadership Summit, 20 USC athletes, including 6 football players, chose to make a very different journey to Eastern Europe to learn more in person about the Holocaust.
It's an opportunity to bring some of our most important leaders, athletes, to these subjects early so that they can then use their platforms to compel a world that rejects anti-Semitism and hate.
Thank you for inviting me to speak today. I was a witness to something that needs to be remembered.
As part of the program, the athletes met with 93-year-old Holocaust survivor, Irene Weiss.
Finally, the train.
Irene shared her story.
A guard slammed the door shut and bolted it from the outside. No one told us our destination.
At 13, she and her sister were separated from their family forever at the Auschwitz concentration camp. The moment documented by a Nazi photographer.
I want to show you that this is the picture where I was just separated from my family, and I am right here. This is me. The family was torn apart, and most of them killed upon arrival, and we never did see each other again. My parents and all the children and all the grandparents were on a road that led to a gas chamber. I never accepted it. Absolutely not. It's not comprehensible. I found my 2 little brothers here. So this one and this one. And my mother is this one right here, sitting next to them on the floor here.
Seeing the pictures that she showed us, the last moment she's seen her mother and her brothers, it's still touching to me to this day.
The trip to Poland was shaped most deeply by the athletes' visit to Auschwitz. They walked through the remnants of the camp where more than 1 million were killed.
Just seeing like the different things that were left behind, the luggage and clothes and blankets and different things with names and addresses, even baby shoes. These memorials set up, and it's just this grass field. And our tour guide told us that we're standing just a couple feet from millions of ashes.
We did walk through the gas chambers. One point that really like hit hard was when we seen the children's shoes. There was millions on like stacked up piles of children's shoes. That's something that like I probably won't ever forget.
The players are now back to their game, their season, their team, challenged and changed.
We lived these days not really noticing how quick our lives can change. It opened up my mind into how blessed I am to have the family I have and the people around me.
My personal experience, it does affect people, it makes them think. It improves their outlook, teaches them humanity.
It really puts perspective being on this team, understanding different people from different backgrounds and how everybody's not raised the same, but we're all at the same place.
The USC program is part of the Shoah Foundation, which was created by Steven Spielberg to build greater awareness of the Holocaust. The players that we spoke to said they were also challenged on this trip when they returned to be greater leaders, not only on the team, but in their communities, to foster a deeper understanding and a greater unity, Rob, among people of all different backgrounds.
Thank you.
Let's continue appreciating them for that wonderful presentation and rich insights. Am I on? Yes, yes, yes. So I took so many notes and have so many commentary. I wish we had more time to engage. I want to start the conversation off with a point that you raised, Rudy, about the really indelible impact that COVID had on our community and higher education in particular. Can we just sort of unpack the last 4 years and the lingering sort of effects of COVID on college student populations, graduate students, but also what it revealed about our sort of gaps in services to students?
Yeah, I think, am I on?
Yes.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest issues that you notice is that, again, as I mentioned earlier, there was this connection that we were able to make as a community, as a society. And to be able to lose that ability to see people, to connect, and all that, we went into isolation. And not just from a family standpoint, right? Holidays for some people were through Zoom. We couldn't see people. We would maybe have phone calls and everything. And that's where you saw a lot of the development of the depression, the anxiety, and all of that. So when you connect that to the students, that's where you notice the lack of the services that were available to them. Mm-hmm. Now, one of the things that, now unfortunately COVID happened, however, it did revolutionize mental health as a whole, mm-hmm. because it gave us an opportunity to still access and provide mental health services. However, we were doing it through our computers. So that was definitely one of the benefits that happened with that. But again, you did see the adjustment. So it wasn't just so much, now I'm struggling with this, now I have to learn to live a different way. There was the ongoing fear of, will things ever go back to normal? How is this impacting my family? What can I do to protect my family? So when you combine all those stressors together, it was just extremely overwhelming to the community.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Others?
Yeah, graduate students, both who are enrolled and who are interested in enrolling, really had their experiences disrupted as a result of COVID. Research opportunities are increasingly important to gaining access to graduate education, but one of the things that remote work can't always give you the same opportunities for that in-person does is the chance to be in a lab, is the chance to be doing in-person activities using sophisticated equipment. So we have seen disruptions to the structure of access to graduate education. One of the other changes that has had mixed effects is the change in the structure for standardized tests. For some people, this was a boon. This was, a part of the system that they were ready to get rid of, and they would prefer a system that didn't require it. For others, that was a strong cornerstone of how they felt like they could perform their excellence. And so I think the anxiety that people have often with gaining access to graduate school has been related to that. But we are seeing the same sort of things with that population around impacts of disconnection And as a result, evidence shows that the United States was more affected by COVID in terms of learning outcomes than a lot of other countries. And there's conversation in Washington, D.C. right now about what we can do about that as a country to really reinvest in K-12 education and in higher education to help bring the United States back up to our European, Asian, and African peers.
Yeah, in college athletics, I mean, sort of it really hit the fan, so to speak, when they started canceling basketball games, and that's when that reality kind of hit a lot of us. And for our student athletes here at USC, whether it was sort of, everyone going home and their training being disrupted, their competition being disrupted, and we immediately started looking at ways to support them at home, sending food, sending, what do you call it, DoorDash cards and equipment and exercise equipment through the mail for them to work out and be prepared. And then when they were student athletes, were the first students to come back to campus, if you remember, and we had to build protocols for them in terms of testing, in terms of isolation, competing without fans and travel. So there was a lot of that happened in that space, and there was a lot of questions of whether or not athletics was as important enough, but it seemed to expend all of that, and were they being, the guinea pigs and some of these things. And so there was a lot of consternation that went into addressing the needs of student athletes during COVID.
COVID was one of those national global moments that we had to sort of address, right? We've had several other moments like that recently, social political moments that have implications for one's mental health and well-being. And I think lots of educators are grappling with how best to have conversations with students, recognize that in the classroom, outside of the classroom. I'm wondering what advice or how are you thinking of the educators should be engaging these national moments that certainly have implications for young people and college students, in particular grad students, mental health, especially if there's a heightened sort of vigilance around the moment that can compromise one's mental well-being. Any ideas of how folks should be thinking about that?
I would just say, there's an election in a couple of days, right? And so with our student athletes, we've not only talked with them about getting out and voting, looking at what voting and elections mean not only for the president, but local races and what it meant for them, for their family and their community, using them as opportunities to communicate with young people about the importance of civic responsibilities. And then also talking about some of the stress and concerns that people have about the outcome or outcomes, and just creating spaces to have those conversations and listen and learn from each other. I think is a very important aspect of what goes on for students in that regard.
Adrian?
And another piece of it too is I think during COVID we realized how vulnerable people are, right? Through economic insecurity, housing insecurity, we saw rates of violence increase across the country, right? We also saw more aggressive policing, right? So there are so many things going on, and it's at the same time, it's how do we find balance, right? And I think that was another piece too. It's with so many things going on, right? Social political things, COVID, the fear of family members getting COVID in California, 50% of COVID deaths across the state of California were Latino people, right? So it's what did that mean for those families? That, parents, siblings, families were decimated by COVID, right? But then students were still expected to perform, log in online. Some spaces were more welcoming than others. I even remember my son getting in trouble for eating popcorn at home during online learning, right? And it's just this is a moment where we can be flexible, right? Because everyone's trying to cope and survive. And some educators really leaned into being flexible and giving students grace, and others really try to, be, I guess, I'm trying to, carceral, right? More regulated, more punishing on students when it didn't need to be. But I think one last byproduct of COVID was, now some school districts, to isolate students and make them do virtual learning, even now, right, as a form of punishment, which is really weird that educators found a tool to help students learn as a tool for punishment now. which makes zero sense.
You know, just to put a point on the sort of question around the socio-political moment, I did a study several years ago with colleagues in engineering that looked at the effects of anti-Black protests and police killings on students' sort of sense of belonging and psychological well-being in engineering. And what do you think we found? That it matters, right? What's happening in the world has implications for how students. So sometimes educators are thinking that, you know, we should look the other way and be silent and not acknowledge it. But I actually think it actually sort of compromises students and exacerbates students' precarity. You know, three of you talked about specific student populations, whether it be Latinx students, student athletes, justice involved students. One of the pushbacks, some of the pushback you hear from administrators is around capacity to meet the sort of specific needs of student populations. How do we balance providing comprehensive, robust services that are attentive to all of us in the room, but that are also tailored to meet the specific situated identities of particular groups? Anyone can chime in.
Well,
yeah.
Something that I think there's been a big push for it too. It's like, how do we institutionalize best practices of care, right? Where it's not just, you know, this person for this affinity group and this person for that affinity group. Like, how do we institutionalize like this culture of educators, whether, you know, presidents, chancellors, all the way down to like care about students, right? And their well-being and knowing how complicated their lives are, especially post-COVID, because I just had COVID like 3 weeks ago. You know, but like, how do we, like, you know, we saw again how vulnerable people were, but like there was so much eagerness to go back to normal, even though things weren't normal, right? And like people are still struggling with, you know, adapting to being in large environments. Like people are still struggling to like, you know, catch up on stuff. But I think, you know, in K through 12 and higher ed, there was that opportunity, but it's like, some institutions really leaned into it, right? And others, like, again, that eagerness to go back to normal. And Julie can attest to it with like standardized testing, right? How many schools are eager to get back to standardized testing? And others are like, hey, this was really good for us. Let's keep doing it.
Yeah, Adrian brings up something that I feel like is critical for us to keep an eye on, which is that we can't just rely on offices to take care of populations, that as professionals, it's part of our professional practice to grow and understand the needs of different populations too. And so as long as the standard of practice is to treat a classroom as a classroom and to find some sort of non-existent median or mean that will serve everybody at least decently well, yeah, that might produce relatively okay outcomes, but it's not necessarily going to create a more humane environment.
Right.
It's not going to create an environment where people feel seen, where they feel cared for, where they feel like they belong. So I think we do have a tension between, you know, should our interventions be for professionals who all have spheres of influence with a diverse set of populations, as we do in SoCal, or are we actually talking about institutional and structural change? And I don't think we should expect that interventions that produce structural change will help us get along better and recognize when Black students need a day off because there was just another case of police violence, or when we need to reach out to a trans student because we know that somebody just died. You know, I think that kind of attunement and sensitivity, that happens for individuals in ways that institutional structures aren't well suited for. But we all have the potential to grow a little bit every day with one or more populations.
So let's stay there for a second. You've alluding to what it means to have a shared responsibility, right? And you mentioned earlier around a culture of well-being. Like, let's sketch that out. What does that look like? Who's involved? What does it feel like for folks on a campus where there is a culture of well-being?
Yeah, well, I'm a sociologist, and that means we believe context matters. So I'll start with USC as a context. I think at USC, it's recognizing that we live in a particular place and that commuting and getting to work is part of it. So I do think sketching out what it means is to sort of break down, what does the work look like here? What does learning look like here? What are people's experiences moving through their days, moving through their weeks? And if the goal is to create a culture of well-being, then I think it's about bringing together the sort of groups that are experiencing the days and weeks together. So, you know, whether it's having a class at the beginning of the semester, develop some norms for what it's going to mean for them. Are there going to be accommodations that are sort of class-wide because the group has decided that that's what they want? Or is it going to be something that on a case-by-case basis, professors and staff members and administrators start to recognize that when students are struggling, something needs to change, and you are really getting good at working with that. I do think culture can be changed one student at a time, but I think it's more powerful to be in sort of changing the spaces in which we come together. And I've appreciated the principle of working with informal learning spaces, because I think that's a big part of where culture happens on college campuses.
Rudy, you were going to say something?
Yeah, and I think as far as your most recent question, I think it falls on all of us. It's not just myself or one student or just one faculty member. It falls on all of us. There should be this expectation of celebrating who we are as an individual, but also celebrating the differences of others. And even with everything that's happening across the globe right now, we're going to have differences. We're not going to agree with each other. But how can we be respectful of each other and celebrate who we are, not only as an individual, but as a society, as a university, whatever the setting may be. And I think that's one of the key things to that, understanding the experiences of others. And even going back to your previous question as far as what's our role in all of this, I think, can we provide an example to our students of what these uncomfortable conversations look like? Because the reality is, even from a COVID standpoint, how has that impacted our ability to have these uncomfortable conversations with others? The reality is we tend to avoid a lot of the uncomfortableness. Now, as I tell my students, my apologies for the word, but I always encourage my students to sit in the shit. They have to sit in the uncomfortableness of working with clients, of their own uncomfortableness, of their own material that they have to deal with. How do we learn to sit in each other's, you know what?
Yeah, I would just add that it also sort of what I was trying to convey earlier is this like understanding where there are traditions and sort of ways of being from the past or status that has been valued that's no longer valued. And testing might be a part of it. Not that testing in itself is not valued, but the idea of screening or large, we deal with student athletes in particular around undergraduate coursework, traveling, missing a lot of class, whether or not they need to actually be in class because that's the way it's always been done. Proctoring exams or looking at alternative ways of measuring or assessing learning. You find there are a lot of traditions that are out there that we really need to revalue in terms of wellness and what works. But a lot of folks are just so caught up in like the way in which they were hazed or brought into the system that they want to uphold it, never realizing that there might be some new ways of doing things.
Yeah, when the unionization of graduate students happened, or doctoral students happened at USC, I was really impressed with how our Vice Provost for Graduate Education, Andy Stott, handled it, and in part because he got people together who would have the discussions about what is to be gained in this moment by this. And we were able to hear from people that it's an opportunity to unwind some practices that were never healthy, right? And so having the need to find a contract and negotiate it and then to implement it forced people to have conversations and reflections that were long overdue. I think that's a critical part of a culture of well-being too, is to recognize how the structural environment creates norms. We create norms through how we operate in the classroom and supervise and so on, but policies create norms too.
And who's best served?
Exactly.
Asking the question who's best served by those policies and not best served. I want to switch gears to talk about technology. We're in the moment where AI is pervasive and we're reimagining how we engage technology in so many different ways. I got asked to give a quote about AI and sort of academic advising in lieu of an actual sort of person advising. What are some promises and possibilities for leaning into technology to help support mental health services? And what are some cautions that we should be thinking about?
Well, people know me. I mean, I lean into AI, and I think that from a mental health perspective, obviously the ability to have therapy online, as you say, was transformational in the industry. The ability to use technology virtually. I mean, there's research that shows that young people would rather talk to a bot than a person.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, I might be a little disappointing if you're an adult, right? Or if you have kids, your kids, right? But the reality is, would you rather them get help from somewhere rather than nowhere, and putting guardrails on that and understanding what needs to be done? But I feel like there's a lot of opportunity and there are a lot of challenges, and that by we had a project this summer with Charles Liu over at Keck Medicine, where we brought in students from around the country and the world to look at some of the advances in neurotechnology and ask questions about AI and ethics and that kind of thing. And the reality is, the question was, should we be developing devices where you can read someone's thoughts through blood flow, which is what they're doing now, to control a robot if you're paralyzed? And it sounds scary, right? But the question is, should we be doing that? And the kids that we talked to, high school kids, said, yeah, we should be, as long as we're thinking about the ethics and people are informed about these practices. So I would say the same thing for mental health, is that there's a lot of opportunity there to overcome disparities and a lack of access. And we would be really wrong, it would be wrong for us not to lean into it, but also figure out how to do it the right way. That would be my take.
Yeah, so like in one way, it's like the democratizing of access, right? But then there's also the caution, and that is that our most needy communities, most in need communities, oftentimes in lieu of resources to support human capital, they get diverted to technology, which oftentimes doesn't, it may not be comparable to the sort of high quality touch points, right? Yeah.
And if I may, to that point, if you look at just some sort of normal everyday community-based mental health programs, usually those types of programs, the clients are of lower social or financial resources. So what do we need in order to have a Zoom session? Sure, it revolutionized our profession, but what do you need? At a minimum, you need a cell phone. So what happens if that client doesn't have a cell phone? Okay, well, we need a computer. Well, what happens if they don't have a computer? So even though it tends to expand the possibility of services as far as the access, it also minimizes it for a certain population. So that's one of the biggest drawbacks that I've seen from it. From a clinician standpoint, it's very different to do therapy in person versus Zoom. So the beauty of it for the client, though, if we are meeting them where they're at, think about the possibility of having to leave your home, driving to your therapist's office. You walk in, it's a very cold environment. Now, for the most part, we try to make it nice and welcoming, but still, it's still not just a typical place that we all like to go to for the most part. The anxiety that comes up with that, especially during your very first session. Now, you have your computer, this therapist offers therapy on Zoom. You get to do it in the comfort of your own home. There's a safety component that goes along with all of that. So that's one of the beauties behind it as well. But now as a clinician, we respond differently. I'm a little bit weird in that when I'm working with someone, my body responds somatically. So there's that energy that I get from that individual. When I first started doing Zoom, I totally lost that ability to do it because I couldn't feel that person's energy. I couldn't see, for example, if somebody is shaking their legs, twiddling their thumbs, I lost all of that, which is a big part of what we do. So even there, developing the relationship initially was a little bit harder. However, the longer I did it, the more my body adjusted, and I started to feel the energy based off of what I was seeing in that screen. It's a very interesting way to really describe it, but it happens. It happens.
Let's take some questions from the audience. Any initial questions, reactions? Yes. Oh, yes, microphone.
Yeah, I think this is a very intriguing panel and a very intriguing event. And what I'm thinking of now is two words, the opportunities and outcomes. Now, whoever we deal with, whatever, if a therapist, I work with kids with disabilities, autism, ADHD, and learning issues. Now, I like everybody's point, but in particular, both of you, when you go into that room and you close the door, and it's not a small group, it's one individual you're working with, and it's the first visit, you have to see in yourself and feel that there's something going on in that person that you can move forward. And in reference to, Alan's point of view, that person's background could be any background. Immigrant, gang, family, poverty, anything. But those thoughts, as they come through your mind and you perceive them visually, you have to lower your concept and talk to the person, to the individual, to the student, to the graduate student, we'll stick with that, because you feel that there's a need that you have to understand what the issues are. So as we move, I'm just about finished. I think that these forums put the tea bag in the hot water. And we're all here sipping tea. So, we're one of the 21% of universities that we're working with an existing situation, and we feel it's working. There's no timetable, there's just the emotion and the feeling that we have, and as long as we do that, there will be progress. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment. Thank you. We have a question or hand raised over here.
Thank you. Just hearing you all speak about mental health and supporting students from K-12, 20, throughout the whole journey, it's very focused on students, which is great, but I also know that as professionals, whether it's staff or faculty, how often do we receive these resources to understand how to support students? And from a structural institutional standpoint, what recommendations do you have to support the professional in learning how to support the student?
Yeah, join my consortium. Maybe we'll offer you 3 professional development workshops. The first is called Introduction to Equity-Minded Mentoring, which offers a research and theory-based framework to help faculty and other practitioners understand how to do mentoring from an equity perspective, but also how to begin changing your organizations in that direction. Another one is about fostering well-being in racialized mentoring environments, to recognize all of the many, many ways that mentoring can be racialized and ways that compromise well-being, particularly for minoritized students. And then the third one is about creating organizational cultures of mentoring and well-being, where you think about what are your incentive systems, what are your accountability mechanisms, if any, what are your rewards for high-quality mentorship and supporting well-being. I do think you're totally right, Mabel, that like people need a chance to learn, right? Because as Alan mentioned, the systems that we all came up through are inequitable and they don't promote well-being. So there's a lot to unlearn, and then there's research-based practice that somehow we've got to learn. I thought you were going to go a different direction with your question, though. I thought you were going to talk about the well-being of professors and the well-being of staff and administrators, which is a serious issue as well. You know, everybody's navigating a world. Everybody's part of a power structure and part of incentive systems. And we've got real needs here at USC and around the country in that area too.
Which I think is a good plug for next semester's panels on this topic, and looking at educators and leaders in terms of how to practice. I tried to couch my comments earlier from the perspective of not only what it takes to pursue mental health or wellness, well-being, mental health for, in the case of student athletes, but also for myself, because what I've learned, and it maybe didn't come across well, is that through the different journeys I found is like that authenticity and that accountability that I was talking about, like I needed it for myself. Not only like to hold others accountable, but to hold myself accountable, to be authentic with myself. And so those questions that I try to ask in those different spaces, some are more opening and inviting to change more so than others, is really for my own sanity, so that I can help others. So your point is well taken.
Rudy, you're going to say something?
And one of the things that I would recommend is a willingness to be vulnerable. Now, what do I mean by that? A willingness to acknowledge that we need help. a willingness to talk to someone else when we are struggling. I consider myself to be very blessed knowing that our program lead is Dr. Theo Burns. I adore that man. And I know he has my back. When I've had struggles, I've gone to him. When I've had struggles, I've gone to Dr. Sandy Smith, to Dr. Mary Andres. I've gone to a number of different faculty members because I know that we are there for each other. The reality is, especially as a clinician, I can't expect my client to do something I'm not willing to do myself. And even as faculty, I would say I cannot expect my students to have uncomfortable conversations if I'm not willing to have them myself. So I think a part of that is being able to reflect and looking within. Now that can be very difficult, as we can see across the board in this room. We're a pretty diverse group. But from a cultural standpoint, how many of our cultures tell us that if we seek help, it's a sign of weakness, that we shouldn't do that we're bringing shame to our families, to our, whatever the case may be. Now, just to clarify, I'm not saying that we should reject who we are in our culture, but how can we be true to our culture while at the same time being true to our needs and combining both of those?
Yeah, it's a beautiful reflection. Other questions? Yes. Let's wait for the mic.
I feel like I might be bringing you very far back into your research with a question like this, but I do want to kind of question you about how you began to integrate your lives as well as like your passion of your studies into the lives of your students, and how you've established that relationship to start opening up this conversation about wellness with them, especially when you're, you know, trying to speak to students who are coming from such a diverse and often tough background. What does that look like, integrating yourself into their lives without coming across as somebody who could be seen as quote unquote a narc, or almost just like seen as somebody who may not understand their walk through you know, the lens that you're coming at?
That's a great question. Anyone want to take it first? Adrian?
So something I know I've done with my students is like, I can't require it, but I definitely promote the use of like therapy and like counseling, especially with the projects that I'm doing, like focused on gang involved people. Like reading transcripts, it's like you're experiencing like secondary trauma, right? You're seeing how all these people mistreated this person, what their experiences were in prison, what their experiences were being attacked, all these things. Like, you might not feel it immediately, but I'm sure like your immune system's like, what are you doing to me, right? Like just probably not even aware of like everything that's happening in your body, like because you're having such an adverse reaction to that. But I think it's also the demands of like doctoral programs that maybe at that moment they might not need a therapist, but at some point you're going to need someone that's going to be unbiased to be able to like calibrate your thoughts or like learn new practices or techniques to be able to continue moving forward. Especially in doctoral programs, it's a marathon, right? And I think the hardest part of a doctoral program is probably like your internal voice of like, oh, I'm not doing this, or I can do this better. Like you could be micro-critiquing yourself on like how to get better, right? But that might not help you. You're just like putting more pressure on yourself. So I've told my students, I'm like, you know, you might not need a therapist week 2, but that person might be in handy week 8. But it's important to develop that relationship so then that way that person can see you when you're kind of balanced, right? Versus when you're emotionally all over the place, right?
Other reflections?
Yeah, I would say whether it's as a clinician in the room doing therapy or doing research or preparing teachers or leaders, you got to really help whoever you're working with frame whatever you're working on as something that they are embedded in, and that you're not teaching math separate from the human experience. You're not teaching how to analyze data from your own experience. I just got on the phone today with one of my doc students who's analyzing their data and is stressed out about some things. And we had a conversation about whether or not the analysis that they were trying to do under a time crunch was being impacted by the life events that they were going on, right? So, and it wasn't like the first time we had a conversation. It's like, this work exists within the laboratory of your life.
Yeah.
So so keeping it real in that regard, I think, is very important.
I mean, I was going to say, you know, we don't live in a vacuum, right? So how do we create space for people to bring the fullness of who they are in the classroom, in our advising research team meetings, right? Recognizing that what is happening in your world shapes how you perform. how you show up, how you engage. And sometimes we wrongly interpret one's disengagement as a sign that they don't value the experience, but we haven't created space for them to express or feel comfortable engaging the fullness of themselves. I think the other way we do it is, part of how we build efficacy is through role modeling. So when I'm having a difficult day and I need a mental health reset, there's a degree of vulnerability that is necessary for me to express that in front of my students. And it empowers them, I think, to do the same. So I think one way we do it is role modeling for students and being vulnerable ourselves.
If I may, going back to Alan's, to take your last words, I think keeping it real goes a long way. There's got to be that authenticity in when you are speaking with your students. And not only that, but even though when there's a shared cultural background, is not to make assumptions. Because we all have different experiences. So there's an openness of having approaching these interactions with my students with an openness, a sensitivity, but also a curiosity of learning what makes them them. And I think that's what's allowed me to develop some really strong relationships with some of my students.
Any final questions? I know there are no questions online, right? Just to be sure. If not, we have one in the corner here.
I happen to be a mental health practitioner as well as an organizational consultant under the umbrella of HR. And I think there really is a need, especially post-COVID, to address not just students but faculty and to provide some training. I'm a clinical social worker. I got both my degrees here at USC. I taught in the School of Social Work. One day I may tell you a lot about what I learned teaching, but I do think that the teachers, the faculty, and teachers in school need some more training, some mental health training. And one of the speakers, I think it was, you as a Dr. Roman, mentioned that actually there's benefit in learning some of the social work skills. I train law enforcement in engagement skills. And I think some of the engagement skills would be very worthwhile to provide for educators, because a lot of times the educators are the first adult these children or these teenagers or these college students really have access to talking to.
And I appreciate that point, because I think even to that degree, it's not only the first person they have access to, but then do we become the first person they feel safe with?
Exactly.
So then how do we help or water the seed that was just planted to help that relationship grow? So I think that's a point well made.
Zoe?
Thank you all so much. I did want to say that the last session we had focused on K-12 educators, and that we did talk about strategies for in that space, and that is posted online, as this discussion will also be posted online. And then we already have mentioned that in the spring we're going to be focusing on different practitioners, but we have one more session this semester, and we're going to be focusing on third spaces or informal learning spaces. So we hope that you come back to that. There's going to be some really interesting speakers at that panel, also more online. There's going to be a skateboarder here. There's going to be, anyway, it's a really great panel. That's my segue to wrapping up. So I'll flip it back over to Royel.
Well, with that, will you join me in appreciating our dynamic panel today? And for folks who are free to stick around for a bit, we have some light refreshments in the back and food. And I just want to, again, appreciate Corey, Zoe, Eric, who's online, Kanae and her team, for all those folks who've played a role in bringing this into fruition. Can we appreciate them? Emmy. Yes. Thank you all so much.